All right, guys, I think we're going to get started. Welcome. This is the voter fraud panel. By way of introduction, my name is Guy Benson. I'll be the moderator. I'm the political editor at Townhall.com and also a Fox News contributor. And I am obligated to let you know that I have a book coming out co-authored with Mary Catherine Ham. It's called End of Discussion. So you can find out more in pre-order at endofdiscussion.com. And now my publisher will not kill me for failing to make that shameless plug. So with that out of the way, I want to turn our attention to the issue at hand. And I'll begin by giving you just some background on our three distinguished panelists, offer a few words, and then we'll kick things off with Congressman Peter Roskam, who might know a thing or two about voting irregularities, being from the Chicago area. He represents Illinois' 6th Congressional District. He was House Republicans' Chief Deputy Whip from 2011 through this past December, and currently serves as the chairman of the House Ways and Means Oversight Subcommittee. And you may have seen him on C-SPAN tangling pretty hard with the IRS commissioner over the last few months, our dear friend John Koskinen.
Thank you.
I assume the applause is for the congressman and not the IRS commissioner. Don McGahn is a former chairman of the Federal Election Commission. Upon his departure in 2013, the Washington Post called his tenure at the FEC, quote, one of the most consequential in the Commission's 38-year history. The Post also said that his time at the FEC was characterized by frequent clashes with Democrats and a persistent skepticism about government meddling in elections and campaigns. So it sounds like he pissed off a lot of the right people for the right reasons. Speaking of which, James O'Keefe is a filmmaker. Muckraker, and provocateur. His investigative videos have exposed corruption from coast to coast, targeting everyone from Planned Parenthood to Acorn to government sector unions. His Project Veritas organization is also focused heavily of late on voter fraud and the left's effort to undermine voter integrity. So our overall discussion today is about a loaded topic, voter fraud. To hear some conservatives tell it, voter fraud is a pervasive, insidious problem that allows Democrats to routinely steal elections. Many on the left angrily dismiss voter fraud as a figment of conservatives' imagination, a phantom, a non-existent problem. They allege that voter integrity laws supported primarily by Republicans are nothing short of voter suppression, especially aimed at depressing minority turnout. I personally don't believe either of those characterizations are accurate. Voter fraud is not quite as widespread and determinative as some might suggest. It is also most certainly not a myth. Efforts like voter ID laws have been ruled constitutional by the Supreme Court. They are wildly popular with the American people, including among people of color, and they have been empirically proven not to reduce turnout among minority voters. So before I turn things over to our panelists, I want to leave you with a short, illuminating vignette from Cincinnati, Ohio. And this was reported in the Cincinnati Enquirer, and this is in the book, End of Discussion. So, and it pertains particularly to our topic. At a rally against voter ID laws in 2014, keynoted by who else? Al Sharpton, and co-sponsored by the Ohio Democratic Party, a very special guest was honored on stage. That guest was named Meloise Richardson, a local woman who beamed and waved to the crowd as she was greeted with an ovation and embraced by Sharpton. What had Ms. Richardson, a former Ohio poll worker, done to earn such adulation? She'd gotten herself convicted on 4 counts of illegal voting in 2012. That's what. Just before the event, her jail sentence had been reduced to probation, so she was there to bask in the glory of a martyr's welcome from her fellow fraud enthusiasts. The Cincinnati Enquirer recapitulated some of the charmer's greatest hits in their story about her controversial appearance. Quote, Richardson had previously been convicted of threatening to kill a witness in a criminal case against her brother, of stealing, of drunk driving, and of beating someone in a bar fight. And then she became an elections worker. That inspires confidence. State Democrats murmured a few notes of disapproval of this spectacle and then hastily moved on. So the pro tip that I would take away from this is if you're holding an indignant political rally in opposition to racist laws, so-called, designed to address the myth of voter fraud, you might not want to openly celebrate someone who was convicted of engaging in the exact sort of criminal activity that you claim doesn't exist. So that's just one story of many that we can get into. And with that, I'd be delighted to turn things over to Congressman Peter Roskam of Illinois.
Good. Well, thank you very much, Guy. Thanks, CPAC, for the invitation, and thank you all for taking the time to come together. So I've got to take you back to 2006. My predecessor was Congressman Henry Hyde, and I was the nominee to succeed him in a rough year all the way around. The head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee was none other than Congressman Rahm Emanuel at the time. And my district that I was running in was adjacent to both Rahm Emanuel and then Speaker of the House Denny Hastert. So think about this geography. You know the old expression, when the bulls fight, the grass loses? I was the grass. So literally on one side of me, across the street, is Emanuel's district. On the other side of me, across the street, is Hastert's district. My predecessor is Henry Hyde, who impeached Bill Clinton, and it is a larger-than-life experience, something that I was completely surprised by the nature of this race. As we got thinking through this thing, those of you that are familiar with the Chicago area, you'll know that DuPage County, where I come from, is just a happy little fabulous county where everybody's doing their deal and it's a great place. And we've got this love-hate relationship with the city of Chicago. But within the 6th Congressional District was precincts within Cook County, of every bit of reputation that it deserves. So we began to think strategically, what is it that we're going to be doing in Cook County to make sure that the ballots are ballots that are cast with integrity? How do we approach this thing? This turned into a larger-than-life race. $14 million gets spent in this little congressional campaign with outside groups in our campaign, and all in, it was $14 million. Now, what we did was, we didn't decide to focus hardly any attention in DuPage County because of the reason I mentioned before, but we focused all of our attention on Cook County. And what we did was, we got a lawyer on every precinct during that effort. Now here's my theory. My theory is that there are political operators who are willing to commit crimes, but they're not willing to do the time. So if you're communicating that, look, we're present, we're here, we've got lawyers on the ground that are Johnny on it and are going to be playing a very aggressive role, it can have a restraining influence on a lot of the nonsense. So in a $14 million race, then I was never ahead at any point in that campaign. Information that I did not share with my wife, by the way. We were never ahead at any point during the campaign. We won that election by 2 points. Now, this stuff matters. And when it all comes down to it, I've got a couple of facts for you. Within the past 3 election cycles in the House, 14, 12, and 10, of the races that were too close to call a week after the election, we just came out and there were 7 House races that were too close to call a week after the election. In the last cycle, 11 House races, too close to call. The previous cycle, another 7 races. So here's the proof, and let me close by saying this. In Illinois, which just doesn't disappoint when it comes to these questions, in Illinois, the Democratic Party had complete control in the last year. And what they did was they decided to come up with a same-day registration regimen in order to try and create an advantage for the incumbent governor, Pat Quinn. They lost by 4 points, thankfully, but they did a same-day registration program. Now, what's interesting about that? What's interesting about that is they didn't do that in yesterday's mayoral primary in the city of Chicago. Rahm Emanuel didn't allow a same-day registration regime to come after him. So what does that tell you? It tells you everything you have to know in terms of how the ballot is manipulated, how false claims are made, how false pretenses are out there. So what we've got to make sure is that we are not defensive about the way in which sometimes these issues are framed and characterized. We need to make sure that we are the ones that are articulating, look, A ballot with integrity is foundational for who we are as a people. We can win these debates on the merits. We can win these debates by being persuasive and ultimately enact conservative policies, but we need to make sure that we're not chumps and we're not fools and we don't allow ourselves to be rolled and intimidated when it all comes down to it. Thanks, Guy. It's a mercy class.
Thank you. That wasn't for me, but thank you anyway. It's a small world. I remember the 2006 election because I was actually doing legal work for the state party in Illinois. I remember your race well. So my first election day as a grown-up that I was involved in was 1993, Philadelphia. It was a state Senate race between a guy named Marks and a guy named Stinson, and it flipped back and forth a number of times. It controlled the legislative balance of power in the state Senate, and that was a case of massive absentee ballot fraud. We've come a long way since then. A couple points I'd like to make, some of which I think are going to be seen as heresy, some of which may make some sense. Certainly there is the old-fashioned ballot stuffing. That still happens. Occasionally people get arrested for it and do jail time. Sometimes they get rewarded and get promoted within City Hall, which sometimes happens in Philadelphia. The truth, though, is much of what we used to consider to be fraud is no longer fraud. It's actually become legal. Congressman Roskam makes an interesting point about same-day registration. Every election day, I have at least one campaign somewhere or a state party somewhere call and say, it's always the same phrase, they're bussing them in, right? Well, now with same-day registration, you can bus people in and register them. People can flow over from Massachusetts to New Hampshire now and do same-day registration and vote. So what used to be considered fraud has now been made legal. So what does that mean for those of us who want to ensure the integrity of elections? Well, you have to fight fire with fire, and you have to equip yourself with the rules of elections and see what you can do, either maximizing the vote or making sure that what happens is actually in accordance to the rule of law. The key to combating election fraud, I think, is a couple different points. First, the integrity of the voting list is very, very, very important. It solves many, many problems if the list is actually maintained, purged, updated, cross-checked, and whatnot. We talk about that in excruciating detail. By way of background, I'm a lawyer, so I come at this from more of an analytical lawyer-type perspective. So I like to think that, secondly, pre-election prep is very important. Too often, the polls open, voting begins, and then someone says, oh my God, there's a problem, what are we supposed to do? By then, it's too late. One effective technique is to ensure that the procedures by which ballots are to be secured and counted, and what will count and what will not count, is ascertained before the polls open. Sometimes a Freedom of Information Act request, a state version of that, at a state level could pay dividends because it forces the local official to publicly say how they're going to count the ballots. Many times they don't want to say that. They want to figure it out after the fact. There's a very sad, what's become a cliche about it doesn't matter it's not who gets the most votes, it's who counts the votes that wins the election. Next issue is provisional votes, absentee ballots, and the like. Anyone who shows up at a polling place nowadays gets to cast a ballot. Whether it's a ballot that's going to be counted or not really becomes the issue. Just about anyone and their dog can come in and vote provisional. There becomes a massive cottage industry after the polls close as to what ballots will be counted and when, how to secure those ballots and the like. All these are supposed to be done according to some sort of standards and rules, but if you have not established the standards and rules before the polls open, it's going to be made up on a case-by-case basis. Think about the TV coverage of Bush v. Gore, the guy with the hanging chad. Every county had their own thing. Every counter had everybody had their own standard. One war story, former colleague of Congressman Roskam from Colorado, then he was then candidate Bob Beaupre, had a massive recount. There were 3 different counties in his district. Each county had a different standard by which they would count the votes, and what votes would count and what votes wouldn't count. Lesson learned there was it would have been nice to lock it down ahead of time. Colorado now tries to lock everything down ahead of time. So really, the takeaways for me is much of what people say is fraud gets diminished because it's really not fraud anymore. It's become legal. There's certainly still fraud. There is certainly ballot box stuffing, election day shenanigans. Second, the integrity of the list really matters because that's the way to make sure voters who are real vote, and that solves a lot of other problems. There's ways to all kinds of technology to cross-check lists and that kind of thing. Some states do it, some states don't. HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, mandated statewide rolls. This actually solved a lot of problems. You would have different people registered in 2 different counties in the same state, and no one knew because there was no cross-check. So that's the takeaways, and with that, I will yield to, and I feel like the opening act, Mr. O'Keefe.
Thank you very much. Little presentation here on the slides. So we did a couple investigations. I don't know if you've seen them, but in New Hampshire, actually 3 years ago, to visualize some of the things that people were saying. By the way, before I continue, some little breaking news. Daily Mail is reporting, speaking of Al Sharpton, that they're going to fire Al Sharpton from MSNBC. But we'll leave Al Sharpton aside for a minute. So visualizing voter fraud is something that we really wanted to do, and people said that, you know, photo ID is racist. So the first thing we did is we went to New Hampshire, and we went up to the polls where they had, you know, names of people who were deceased, and I simply said, do you have that individual? It said, his name is John Smith. Do you have John Smith? And they handed me John Smith's ballot. We did that 12 times, and my favorite moment from the video is when the pollster, the woman behind the booth, said, well, how am I supposed to know if this voter is dead or not? That's her quote. She was actually, I think, the daughter or the sister of one of the people in New Hampshire who was the governor's office. So, and then they passed a photo ID bill after that video. Again, I've never lobbied anybody. I don't know how to lobby people, but the video is so powerful that people oftentimes make the best decisions. This is The Nation, certainly not a friend of freedom. In The Nation magazine, thinking that I scammed voter ID laws into existence. I've never had to lobby anyone to pass a photo ID law. I just show the video and people are shocked into doing the right thing. One of the remarkable things, going back to New Hampshire, about this investigation into voter fraud is that the Attorney General, the Assistant Attorney General of the state of New Hampshire, I can't make this up, the guy's name is actually Richard Head, like Dickhead. And Dickhead was working with Eric Holder and sent FBI agents to try to harass my reporters, subpoena my reporters, so sometimes you just can't make this stuff up. In Virginia, across the Potomac, another investigation that we did that I think really showed something really important was Congressman Moran's son, Patrick, resigned after he said that, well, you need to forge utility bills to vote multiple times for President Obama. And the remarkable thing about this is people say, well, how do you get this stuff talked about outside the conservative movement? Well, in this case, every single TV station, CBS News, ABC News, all the DC, Fox DC, were covering the video. So I think, you know, we can get this stuff into the mainstream media. It's a matter of breaking news. Most recently in Colorado, there's me wearing a prosthetic mustache because I can't grow facial hair. And a makeup artist made me look a little older. And I went to speak with officials that worked in Greenpeace, Colorado. And in and around the Udall campaign, this Greenpeace official was saying, and there's a little bit of racism here too, she said, why don't you go to the ghetto, it's her words, not mine, the ghetto in Aurora, Colorado, and go dumpster diving for other people's ballots. And she even gave me an address to do that. So she was fired, and if you look at this here, we even got one individual, this is Meredith Hicks at Work for Progress, quote, that's not even lying or stealing. If someone throws out the ballot, if you want to fill it out, you should do it. Kind of talking about mail-in ballots in Colorado. She was fired. We just get a lot of people fired. And one of my favorite moments involving voter fraud was we did this, the same thing we did in New Hampshire, we did it with Eric Holder. We went up to say that, you know, photo ID is racist, photo ID is bad. So we went up to Eric Holder's poll location in Northwest District of Columbia and said, hey, do you have Eric Holder on your poll list? And here you go, Mr. Holder. Now, if I said I was Eric Holder, I would myself be committing a felony, but I didn't say that. I just went up right to the line without crossing it. And New York Times launched an investigation, but this is the best part. On Election Day, 2012, Eric Holder had a picture of himself put on the place where he himself casts his own ballot. So the Attorney General of the United States thinks photo ID is a bad idea, but he instituted photo ID for himself. It's like something you'd see out of Animal Farm. To visualize the matter further, this is in post-production, I actually put 20 of myself on a bus in North Carolina, because there's no photo ID in North Carolina. And I went around and got offered 20 different ballots. I got offered a ballot every time except once, when the poll worker actually broke the rules and asked me to see my driver's license. And I said, I don't have a driver's license. Well, you can't vote. So they had to go outside the rules to do the right thing. We've also looked at Battleground Texas organization, which is kind of an acorn group in Texas, and we infiltrated them. We caught a lot of people on tape. They were very scared about what we exposed. We didn't really expose voter fraud so much as people giving out people's private information off of the voter registration forms, which was a misdemeanor. And there were some criminal investigations, and that's what the executive director was quoted as saying this week. We got the blank kicked out of us. So some important points. Even someone like Eric Holder can be impersonated. Many on the left will absolutely disregard the integrity of the vote and use racism. You know, black people don't care about voting, to quote the Greenpeace official. And laws can be changed. Now, if you were to hire a lobbyist, you'd have to spend, I don't know, $100 million to change these laws, but we didn't do that. We just exposed the truth. And I think the truth is often the best defense. Thank you very much.
All right, so I want to facilitate a bit of a discussion here, and then we'll turn it over for some of your questions, starting with Congressman Roskam, and this is a political question. One of the things that always fascinates me and sort of boggles my mind is how there are some Republicans, not all, but some Republicans who seem very defensive and bashful and almost timid about supporting voter ID laws because of this loud roar of disapproval that comes from a very small number of people. If you look at public polling on this, from the Washington Post and McClatchy and other pollsters, this is a 75-25 issue for us. How is it that this small group of activists is able to successfully, in some cases, convince Republicans that they're going to, it is somehow a political loser, when in fact it's 75-25?
Look, that type of thing is actually an old story. And what we've got to figure out as a movement is, are we going to lean into our value system and explain it and defend it and articulate it and invite people to follow us? Or are we going to allow the terms to be determined by someone else and groups that are just not our friends? So it goes to, you know, like in the Chronicles of Narnia, when the Aslan figure says, hey, there's a deeper magic here, there's something actually else that's going on. The deeper magic, as it were, you could take that application and that admonition on any number of issues. It could be on the life issue, it could be on Second Amendment, it could be on one thing after another. And if we go into the public square and we are defensive, we're going to get eaten alive. If we go in and we say, no, we've got a worldview that is actually great. We've got something that you want to be a part of. We've got something that you want to join, and here's why, and these things make sense. It's much more attractive. So I think I go back sort of to the deeper magic. St. Ambrose, church father of the 4th century, is credited as saying something. It applied to his Christian faith, but it applies generally to some of these themes. And he said, we don't impose on the world. We propose a more excellent way. And so what we're doing is we are proposing something that is more excellent. Let me just make one other point. As I was watching the snapshots of the video and so forth, and the explanations a minute ago about them, they really stuck in sharp contrast to an image that I had, something that I saw a year ago in Ukraine. I went to Ukraine for the election monitoring of the first presidential election, where the President Poroshenko was elected. There were a number of folks that came in from the West, basically. And I went out with the International Republican Institute, and I went up to some city north of Kiev for a couple hours north, and went out into the countryside. And there I am, seated with a number of other election observers. And in walks two elderly women, and I mean really, really quite elderly. And they're having a difficult time walking, and they are right out of central casting. Old, you know, the babushkas, slow moving, and so forth. And I began thinking about them, and I just was speculating. I couldn't talk to them because of the language barrier. But I began speculating, and I began to think, what have these women witnessed in their lives? They've probably witnessed famine. They're that old. They've witnessed Nazis. They've witnessed communists. And here they come out, walking up into some little school in the boondocks, walking up stairs, no handicap stuff, you know what I'm saying? They walk up these stairs, and they take that precious ballot, and they cast it. And I thought, it's an overwhelming image, actually. And it was really formative for me to see that. And so you take that image and the reputation that we have as a nation, and that image, and you contrast it to this nonsense that we've been describing, and you realize, look, we've got an obligation here. And it's not an obligation strictly in terms of a conservative movement and so forth. This is an obligation as it relates to founding principles, to make sure that the electorate get to choose who they want to choose to be their people. And there's so many of these things that conflate into total nonsense. The situation that Guy mentioned a couple of minutes ago when introducing me about the Internal Revenue Service, where these things get off on the wrong foot is where the clear lines of authority become ambiguous. So think about it, if elected representatives aren't really reflecting the people, is it any surprise then that the delegated authority from those people to somebody like the IRS, that gets twisted and distorted, and it becomes cascading and far more difficult? So in answer to your question, we ought not to be defensive. Mm-hmm. We ought to be articulating, explaining this, and ultimately inviting and calling other people out on false claims that this is somehow motivated by something that it's not. We are motivated by the integrity of the ballot and the ability of free people to make free choices in a free nation.
And Don, something that you mentioned, sort of my ears pricked up, talking about the voting lists and making sure that the integrity of those are kept up to date. And I think that's a point that we miss a lot on the right, because we spend a lot of time talking about voter ID laws, which is totally fine. Voter ID laws are popular and needed and smart and just make all the sense in the world. I was in a debate with some lefties on a panel in Colorado last year, and there were some middle schoolers in the audience, and all the lefties were hissing, and they were so angry at what I was saying. And afterwards, the middle schoolers came up and said, well, of course you should have an ID to vote. How is that not a thing? And I was like, yes, from the mouths of babes. It's that obvious. So, you know, we fight this fight all the time on voter ID, but then you look at a lot of the most shady seeming stuff. There was a report last year out of North Carolina that between 30 and 40,000 people voted in North Carolina in the 2012 presidential election and also voted in another state. Same first name, last name, date of birth. And there's a state investigation trying to go through and find who those people are and how they're registered, not just registered in multiple states, but voting in multiple states. A voter ID law in North Carolina would not fix that. Right? Because there's no seemingly cross-jurisdictional purging and keeping of the voter rolls. How do we fix that? Because that strikes me as a much, much bigger problem overall, especially if we get the voter ID thing fixed and implemented in 50 states.
Well, this is why in my opening I said I'm going to say some things that may be seen as heresy out of the gate, and one of them is how important the list is. And I don't talk a lot about voter ID because I see voter ID as just one issue of a much larger issue set. And to me, I see the list as really paramount. Think about the history of voting. Lists were kept at the local level. Oftentimes when you went to vote, you knew the poll worker, they knew you. I live in Virginia, right over the bridge, And I walk in, and the poll worker is somebody I know through politics. She's actually one of the major fundraisers for the Republican Party, and she sits there and she takes her time every election day. And she, oh, hi Don, oh, how you doing? And she really pays attention. But it's tough to find those people to do it. So the question is, how do you get at it another way? And it's through the list. Now, with registration at the Department of Motor Vehicles, right, which started 20 years ago, it seems odd that that information is not used to help purge the list or otherwise cross-check, but a lot of times it's not. Some states have gotten together and adopted a cross-check system where they can cross-check their voter lists and help purge the lists. Some integrate the Department of Motor Vehicles information into their lists, some do not. Online registration, which seems potentially spooky out of the gate, actually, on balance, may be the thing to think about. Not talking online voting, it's a different creature, but online registration, given you do your banking online, it actually provides a little bit more security. There's more of a receipt system. You get the email back and that kind of thing. And then I mentioned the Help America Vote Act had the statewide voter list. That was actually a step forward because it allows us to purge the list. Let me read something that came from the Presidential Commission on Election Administration. This was a commission established by President Obama, Democrat. We're all familiar with him. This is what this commission said. On Election Day 2012, the voter registration system had 191.8 million records and 130.3 million voters managed by officials in 50 states and approximately 8,000 local election offices, with the list used at 186,000 precincts. The quality of the list can affect the ability of people to vote, of election offices to detect problems, and of courts and others monitoring elections to detect election fraud or irregularities. Now, this is a significant statement because first, this is President Obama's commission on election administration. Second, it was a bipartisan commission with both Republicans and Democrats. Third, it acknowledges that there is fraud. So all this stuff about it doesn't really exist, you can point to this document. It's one of the takeaways that it's probably going to go to the screen at the end. You might want to read. Third, finally, this report lays out a lot of things that can be done to get the list under control. And one of them is sort of the cross-check and that kind of thing. It's odd we can do our banking online and that the government seems to know everything else about us, but we don't know anything about how we vote. And just, you know, a moment on the ID thing, I see it as one of many, many solutions to problems, but to put all the eggs in that basket and make the issue, are you for voter ID or against voter ID, to me misses the bigger issue of what's really going on with our elections. Look, if you have to go into a federal building in Washington, D.C., you have to show your driver's license. The libertarian in me always recoils and says, I'm not going to drive a car. Why do you have to see my driver's license? Right? To check out a library book, you have to show a voter ID, but to vote, you just kind of, you know, sashay in and vote. Instinctively, that doesn't make a lot of sense when you present it that way. But if you get hung up on the voter ID thing, you get sucked into this sort of binary choice. And I think we're missing the boat on the list. And you cite a perfectly good example where even with voter ID, you can still have people registered in multiple states, and the ID isn't going to check it, but a unified list would. Now, the libertarian in me, again, gets a little creeped out, the idea of some nationwide list, right? You got to think through that. But it's still going to be administered at the local and state level. It's more of a cross-check thing where states can do their job to purge the list. We don't want a national list. That good God, that'll bring its own problems. But for states to be able to cross-check with other states, check DMV information, death records, things like that, makes it a lot easier. It's also going to make an election administration better. It gets rid of a lot of the long lines because things are going to move quicker because you're not going to have a bunch of people fumbling around at the table pretending there's somebody they're not. It's going to be much easier because the list is going to be clean. And you have a bipartisan commission by President Obama that acknowledges fraud and says the list is the key. That's something we can use as a talking point.
And by the way, just a few points of commentary. It's very interesting. I don't believe it's productive to impugn your opposition's motives whenever possible. But when you see headlines, so Governor Rick Scott in Florida tried to purge the voter list in Florida, which means get rid of people who shouldn't be there, felons, dead people. And the Democrats went ballistic and said this is an attack, this is voter suppression. It's like, well, yes, we're suppressing the votes of people who can't, who shouldn't, who legally cannot do it. And so I don't know what you call that other than pro-fraud. And so, I mean, sometimes you have to just sort of call it like it is, and on this one, it's very stark. The other quick point I'm making, and I've got a question for James, on voter ID, because I have these debates frequently with friends of mine on the left, and they make the point that voting is an absolute right. It's a foundational right for our citizens. And I think that we can all agree on that, left and right. People who have the right to vote in this country ought to be able to do it, no questions asked. The question is, how do you make that possible? They say for some people who may be very elderly from underserved communities, who've never had IDs in their lives, aren't you targeting those people and perhaps disenfranchising them? And you can go back and forth about disenfranchisement versus fraud and the balancing act there, but to me it seems like a core appropriate function of government is to get those people IDs, right? The solution isn't to say, well, those people don't have them, so let's not require them at all. The solution is let's make sure that people who need IDs have them. And the left that believes that the government is capable of everything, they think they can run our health care. They think they can run our everything. Somehow, all of a sudden, on this one thing, are skeptical of the government's ability to get people IDs. And I think sort of throwing that hypocrisy back in their faces and say, hang on, this is something that we can all agree the government should do. Doesn't the government have the power to do this? Isn't this something we can work together? You can say, by the way, Republicans, the people who are most likely to not have IDs are senior citizens and minorities. If you want to make a cynical partisan argument, Democrats have increased incentive to make sure that minorities get their IDs, and Republicans have increased incentive to make sure seniors get their IDs. There's a way to do this where the government can actually do it, but all of a sudden there's some small government skepticism from the left, which seems odd. James, this is more of a process question than a fraud question, but with those screen caps and some of those headlines and the attacks on you and the videos that you do, are you ever amused by, like the Mother Jones video, the undercover video that got Mitt Romney saying 47%, the left loves whistleblowers. The left loves these types of investigations and exposing what people are saying to special interests or behind closed doors. But when you do it, it is, in their minds, a crime, and they've tried on several occasions to put you in prison. What's that about?
Yeah, dickhead working with Eric Holder. It's pretty amazing. I think that you know, we call them liberal. My adversaries are not liberal, they're illiberal. I don't use this word lightly, but in the case where they try to put you in jail because you're a reporter, that's fascism. That's not liberalism. Yes, we've been attacked, and I think that it comes down to they don't like reality. What we do is we turn a camera and hit the record button, and they hate that. Well, why do they hate reality? So there's this effort to suppress truth, suppress reality, to be against people exposing reality. So in many ways, they're Puritans. They're not left, they're not liberal, they're Puritans who have a very specific view of the world, and that view does not comply with reality. In terms of the Mother Jones piece, Mother Jones magazine won a Polk Award. A Polk Award, and David Korn, he's the one who's involved with Bill O'Reilly right now. Right. David Korn is the editor-in-chief of Mother Jones, won a Polk Award for not even doing the undercover recording of Mitt Romney. He won the Polk Award because somebody emailed him the undercover recording and he published it. That's pretty amazing. But I think over time you're going to see things change. When independent media is able to do stuff like this, I think you're going to see things come around. I think the attacks have subsided a little bit. But it's up to us to break news, to force our way into the conversation. I second the congressman's point about offense versus defense. We have to go on offense. I think conservatives oftentimes, if it was a slow news day, they'd kind of sit on their hands and go, oh, nothing's happening today. They react to what they do. And the reason they do it, Guy, the reason I find is that conservatives don't like blood on their hands. They don't like to be the ones in front of something because they shy away from controversy, and the left does not have that problem. The left loves blood on their hands and loves to get themselves embroiled like David Korn does in a story. So it's about psychology, it's about what to call themselves, but I don't call them liberal, I call them illiberal.
And I think we've all seen that, metaphorically, you have quite a lot of blood on your hands, because you've, at least jobs-wise, you have been wielding the battle axe against a lot of lefties' jobs who have been caught doing what they do on camera and sent packing. All right, guys, in the time that we have remaining, I think it's about 15 minutes, I just wanted to open it up for any questions that you may have for any of the panelists. The only thing I would say is please direct your question to one panelist. And again, a question is a sentence ending in a question mark. Yes, sir.
I'm going to hopefully not be too bad with that, but I come from John Murphy's district in Pennsylvania. I have an area that's 100,000 people, 50,000 Democrats, 20,000 Democrats. We just got our first push that we had to push through on our list. First time in 80 years, our last election, we had a complete Republican sweep after we started doing the purge. We had 30,000 dead people on our list out of 100,000. I mean, you hear about Philly, we're on the other side of the state, but I agree with you wholeheartedly. Is there anything that you can suggest that we started poll watching, which was push the purge issue. Is there anything you suggest that would help us to continue to push the county to do the purge? We just finished one in December, and they're still got a lot. They only have 11,000 out of 30. So.
Yeah. You know, I have the bizarre life of having grown up in a family with politicians and politics, and I had an uncle that was elected to state office, and in a federal election year, his team went to court, federal court, to purge the voter rolls, and they managed to knock off about 1,200 votes, dead people off the rolls. And the next election, the state election, he won by 1,100 votes. So I learned at a young age that elections are mathematical exercises. They're not student body popularity contests. At the end of the day, they're math. Things to do is be vigilant year-round, not wait till election day. One way to hold the feet to the fire of local officials is to hit them with public information requests for their prospects, for their procedures and processes on how they're going to count the votes. That really throws them for a loop if they know someone's watching. Second, poll watchers help, but knowing the rules before the polls open, trying to lock them in, matters. One example of not so recent history was the Al Franken Senate race. Mm-hmm. That race was really lost before the Republican team got it together. By the time they shipped in the big guns who had done it before, the Democrats had been on the ground the whole time, and it was already slipping away. In my experience, that holds true today, where you can get a feel of how it's happening even before the polls open. So something I always stress is to try to lock the stuff in ahead of time. And that takes some effort year-round. It's not something you just dust off Halloween weekend and say, oh, it's election, what are we going to do? Where's our poll watchers? Something that has to start much earlier, particularly with early vote. You know, some states had very wide voting times, absentees, and the like.
Actually, can I ask you about early vote? Because that's another thing that we haven't talked about yet. It seems like mostly the Democrats are constantly trying to expand vote, election day to election month or months.
Sort of.
What do you think is an appropriate amount of time for people to be able to vote early?
It's kind of, the truth is, if you look nationally, a lot of the early vote has sort of had bipartisan support. Mm-hmm. Now, one could say that's just the establishment protecting their own. That's a whole different panel discussion, not one that I'm here to have. But it's not really fair to simply chalk it up to Democrats trying to play games. I mean, it's something across the board. Because the voters, in a lot of places, like it to be easier. They like to do it when it's convenient for them. When I was a kid, I remember Election Day was a very symbolic thing. The school would be closed. My parents would take me to the polling place with them. It was the old lever machines in New Jersey. And it was a big deal. And for me, I always liked the idea of a one election day where the entire body politic shows up and pulls the lever.
But that ship has sailed.
And that ship has sailed. And my point, and so secondly, we got to be realistic about that and realize early vote's there. And it really is up to the people. And I think, some is just a week, some's a couple weeks, some seems to be a month. Oregon, I think, is already voting for 2016. They seem to always be voting by mail. I play the cards as they're dealt and play the state laws as they come. So I don't put a lot of thought into what the proper period is. What I put into is how far out from when voting begins you have to start working.
Got it.
Right. So you got to know when you actually start voting and plan whether it's an issue campaign or a political campaign or your voter election day integrity project has to reflect the fact voting starts early, and you can't wait until it opens. And it's pushing back the idea of sending letters to county officials and locking in the standards that much more important and that much sooner. So it's on top of you that much more.
So it's not a question of a month is too long, 2 weeks is ideal. It's a matter of establish what the rules are ahead of time and be prepared for whatever those rules are.
Right.
Okay. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Mr. Roskam, you spoke of putting a lawyer in every precinct. Given how the Cook County machine is automatic privilege to risk careers of anyone gets in their way, how are you able to find enough lawyers to risk their careers to stand up to the machine?
There's a lot of lawyers who are out there. You'd be amazed at Republican lawyer types that are itching for the fight. They are very very generous with their time. We were able to make sure that we had a legal team at the Cook County Courthouse in case we needed to do emergency motions that day. We had one at the other courthouse where we didn't have to do anything. And it was amazing the number of people. We were very actively recruiting, so the Republican Lawyers Association was a great source for that.
If I could, can I
Sure.
interject? It's a great question. It's always a challenge to find enough lawyers to give their time, but they are out there. In our practice group at our law firm, we actually have pretty extensive briefing books and things which we will then share with clients when need be to help ghostwrite this stuff. And part of it is to tell people it's worth their time, and they don't have to be election law experts. They just have to believe in it, and they have to have some courage. And it is very tough to do, but it's part of my theme of it's a year-round process. And there are lawyers in states that I have known for close to 20 years which do this stuff. And after enough years, you actually build up a pretty good Rolodex and you know who to call. The problem is if you're a first-time candidate, you're not part of the in crowd. It's very tough to know how to put this together from scratch. And that is really the gist of the question. How to do it from square one is really tough. Congressman's first race in 06, the state party had a very good operation. I mentioned I was the counsel, and we had an institutional knowledge there that we had built up over several election cycles. The challenge is when it's the first time, it's really tough.
And when you say it's a year-round process, you got to give the left credit. They absolutely know that and believe it, and they live it. Their infrastructure, they have that often locked down. There's
a phrase that sometimes we joke around with, but it's not really a joke, and that is when Republicans lose elections, they go back to their jobs. When Democrats lose elections, they lose their jobs. So there is this sort of understanding that their sort of government-waiting infrastructure is playing for keeps year-round, where we tend to have more weekend warriors, and that's something that hopefully will eventually change.
I think I saw a hand in the back. Yes, ma'am.
I'm from Maryland, and one of the states that had the touchpad voting machines, and they were somehow programmed that when you voted for your list of candidates and you pressed the button, they flipped for the opposite candidate. And fortunately, the first couple of instances were caught by people, but I'm wondering how many instances got through before people actually read. They get a chance to review, but you push a button and it's gone. We had actually in the precinct that I voted in happened. And just wondering who programs these machines, what controls are there and how, obviously somebody's programming them to do that, and what kind of control can we put on the type of machines, and should they all be the same, or does some places have the old-fashioned kind, some don't have the, I don't know. Just wondering how we can keep this from happening in the future.
Well, looking to you.
Yeah, I got a list here. Got some notes. That did happen last cycle in more than one place, and from what my experience was those machines were taken out, fixed, and put back on, and it was a glitch that didn't result in any significant issues. That seemed to be the case when the polls closed and the votes were counted. Some jurisdictions require a verified paper audit trail, so there's actually a second check on the machine to make sure it adds up. The OptiScan is something that avoids that. You have to fill in the dots, but sometimes the machine doesn't read that, and that causes issues. At the end of the day, there is no ideal system to the question of the accuracy of the machines. They are not programmed by local election officials. They kind of come set up, and there are quality checks and that kind of thing. To beat a dead horse, the way to combat it is machines need to be tested before the polls open. We need to watch the election officials do it. You have to demand this happens before they open, and you can't figure out at 9:30 in the morning a machine's been sort of misfiring for a couple hours. Takes a lot of manpower, but it goes back to pre-game prep is really the critical thing, because by the time a machine goes bad, it's too late. You know, when I was growing up, I thought election law lawyers, all they did was they were the guys that went to court and got a bad ballot machine impounded on election day. That's not how you do election days anymore. It has to happen. The other way to do it is if there's a bad machine, you speak up and tell the election official, and you just make some noise and shut it down until they actually take it seriously and take a look at the machine. It's still a problem. However, you know, we bank online and have ATM machines, so at a certain point you think we could figure out a secure way to vote using technology.
And speaking of technology, by the way, thank God we live in the era that we do, because when this happened, people take out their iPhone and they make a video of themselves showing I'm pushing this candidate and this candidate's the check mark. If you come out and just say, this is what happened to me, I think it's, okay, that sounds like a fishtail. It sounds like a conspiracy. But when you have an actual video proof to show people, those videos went viral nationwide, and that drew attention to the problem at least.
Yeah. You know, I think there's another sense of admonition that I'm feeling, and I think a lot of other people are, and I keep going back to this touch point with the IRS and the targeting. You know, when you first hear something, and maybe it's just human nature, maybe it's being the father of 4 children, I don't know. But when I first hear something, I think, oh, I don't know. Is that really happening? Or tell me the other side, or whatever it happens to be. So when we first heard that people were being targeted, you know, it was like, really? You think you're being targeted? Well, it turns out they were. Turns out it was a bad act. In Cook County, in the last election, here in the governor's race, that exact same thing was happening, where people were going in suburban Cook County. They thought they were going one way on one of the machines, and it was exactly as you described. But I think that sort of the power of CPAC, the power of James's videos, the power of all this level of communication between us is this idea that, I don't know, these are not necessarily isolated things, and this is happening here and it's happening there, and we can be a little bit more sensitive to it all the way around and be more attentive to it and less dismissive of it. And to Guy's point, technology is our friend. Technology is absolutely our friend to be able to capture these images and project them to a larger audience.
I'm going to do one more question, ma'am.
Assuming a traditional election day, I would do it in August. Well, sorry. The question was, assuming you want to send in a public records request to a local official, when should you do it? So the answer is, let's assume a traditional election day, right? Magic Tuesday there in November. I would think probably in August. Now, what depends, what would factor into the analysis is the local records law, and could they stall ball and not respond, right? They have a certain number of days to respond, so you'd work back from kind of when you want it. You want to have enough time that you're able to go to a judge and force them to comply if they don't. So rule of thumb is August for the general primary. Again, it depends, probably 2 to 3 months out from a primary. Yeah. The OptiScan. You fill in the dots and it scans, yes, the OptiScan. The issue I see with OptiScan is not the machine misreading. It's the machine not reading at all, and then you have to hand count them. And then they have to be secured, and just like traditional ballots. But I don't have any folklore where the machine actually didn't count the right thing. Look, that's how we sort of get into college and law schools, right? You fill in the dots, and that's a technology that's been around for a long time and for the most part works. But if the machine jams, then you have to count them by hand, and then you get into stray marks on the ballot and that kind of thing, which actually, now I think of it, that's the time where maybe it misfires, if somebody doesn't color within the lines or that kind of thing. But the OptiScan, is, in my experience, pretty good.
Is it common practice now for the technicians of the company that oversees these machines and programming them to come in and open the back of the box and do something with them and then leave when there's something wrong with it, nobody's reported a problem? I mean, do they go in there and do any kind of checks or something?
They could. They could.
Without calling?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you've witnessed something and you're sort of wondering if what you witnessed was a problem.
Explaining to me that they saw what going on in their precinct when they went to they didn't know if that was common practice on them.
Could be. I mean, there's diagnostic tests you run. You know, it's almost like it's a kind of mini computer, right? There's different, you go in there and there's ways to make sure it's working.
All right, guys, if you can just join me in thanking our panel, and maybe some will stick around for a couple of questions. Really appreciate it.